Hello everyone, my name's Taylor and I'm currently a junior at Creighton University. Right now I'm here in Omaha with the Nebraska chapter of Generation Connection. For Generation Connection at large, I'm the president and chief executive officer. As a part of our company's aim of connecting generations, I'm going to add a little spin on today's historical topic and discuss the history of the Transcontinental Railroad, a physical bridge of sorts, connecting the United States from east to west, just as our company is trying to connect generations. Perhaps even more ironically, over a 7-year period, the Transcontinental Railroad was built from Sacramento, California on the one side to Omaha, Nebraska, where I am today, before the two companies actually met in their race toward each other at Promontory, Utah on May 10, 1869. All information for today's video is pulled from the article Transcontinental Railroad from History.com, originally published on April 20th of 2010. To truly get the discussion started, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information on how the Transcontinental Railroad went from a mere idea to a vision and eventually to a reality in our first subtopic. America's first steam locomotive made its debut in 1830, and over the next 2 decades, railroad tracks linked many cities on the East Coast. By 1850, some 9,000 miles of track had been laid east of the Missouri River. During that same period, the first settlers began to move westward across the United States. This trend increased dramatically after the discovery of gold in California in 1849. The overland journey across mountains, plains, rivers, and deserts was risky and difficult, and many westward migrants instead chose to travel by sea, taking the 6-month route around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, or risking yellow fever and other diseases by crossing the Isthmus of Panama and traveling by a ship to San Francisco. In 1845, the New York entrepreneur Asa Whitney presented a resolution in Congress proposing the federal funding of a railroad that would stretch the Pacific. Lobbying efforts over the next several years failed due to growing sectionalism in Congress, but the idea remained a potent one. In 1860, a young engineer named Theodore Judah identified the infamous Donner Pass in Northern California, where a group of westward immigrants had become trapped in 1846. As an ideal location for constructing a railroad through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. By 1861, Judah had enlisted a group of investors in Sacramento to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company. He then headed to Washington, where he was able to convince congressional leaders as well as President Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law the following year. Now that I've given you a bit of background information on how the idea of the Transcontinental Railroad came to fruition, I'm going to give a story of 2 competing companies, as mentioned earlier, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroad in our second subtopic. The Pacific Railroad Act stipulated that the Central Pacific Railroad Company would start building in Sacramento and continue east across the Sierra Nevada, while a second company, the Union Pacific Railroad, would build westward from the Missouri River near the Iowa-Nebraska border, where, fun fact, I do my daily runs here in Omaha. And back to our historical topic, the 2 lines of track would meet in the middle. The bill did not designate an exact location, and each company would receive 6,400 acres of land, later doubled to 12,800, and $48,000 in government bonds for every mile of track built. From the beginning, then, it's apparent that the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was essentially set up in terms of a competition between these 2 companies. Now that we've seen how the foundation is set, for this part of the story, a competition between 2 companies, we can dig a little deeper into our third subtopic, the dangers involved in building the Transcontinental Railroad. After General Grenville Dodge, a hero of the Union Army, took control as chief engineer, the Union Pacific finally began to move westward in May 1866. The company suffered bloody attacks on its workers by Native Americans, including members of the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes, who were, very understandably, threatened by the progress of the white man and his iron horse across the native lands. Still, the Union Pacific moved relatively quickly across the plains compared to the slow progress of their rival company through the Sierra. Ramshackle settlements popped up wherever the railroad went, turning into hotbeds of drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence, and producing the enduring mythology of the Wild West. In 1865, after struggling with retaining workers due to the difficulty of the labor, Charles Crocker, who was in charge of construction for the Central Pacific, began hiring Chinese laborers. By that time, some 50,000 Chinese immigrants were living on the West Coast, many having arrived during the gold rush. This was controversial at the time, as the Chinese were considered an inferior race due to pervasive racism. The Chinese laborers proved to be tireless workers, however, and Crocker hired more of them. Some 14,000 were toiling under brutal working conditions in the Sierra Nevada by early 1867. By contrast, the work of the Union Pacific was mainly Irish and Civil War veterans. To blast through the mountains, the Central Pacific built huge wooden trestles on the western slopes to blast through the granite. Ultimately, the work involved in building these railroads was oftentimes very unsafe and hazardous, and lives were lost. Yet the railroads as a project kept moving forward, and by doing so, we are now able to talk about our fourth subtopic, the drive toward the last spike. By the summer of 1867, the Union Pacific was in Wyoming, having covered nearly 4 times as much ground as the Central Pacific Company. The Central Pacific broke through the mountains in late June, however, and the hard part was finally behind them. Both companies then headed towards Salt Lake City, cutting many corners, including building shoddy bridges or sections of track that would have to be rebuilt later in their race to get ahead. By early 1869, the companies were working only miles from each other, and in March, the newly inaugurated President Ulysses S. Grant announced he would withhold federal funds until the two railroad companies agreed on a meeting point. They decided on Promontory Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake, some 690 track miles from Sacramento and 1,086 miles from Omaha. On May 10th, after several delays, a crowd of workers and dignitaries watched as the final spike was driven, linking the Central Pacific and Union Pacific in the Golden Spike ceremony. The Golden Spike was made of 17.6 karat gold and was a gift of David Hughes, a San Francisco contractor and a friend of Big Four member Leland Stanford. During the ceremony, Stanford took the first swing at the spike, but accidentally struck the tie instead. His attempt was followed by Union Pacific Thomas Durant. Durant swung and missed, likely because of a hangover he was suffering from the previous evening's party in Ogden. A railroad worker ultimately drove the final spike at 12:47 p.m. on May 10, 1869. Telegraph cables immediately went out to President Grant and around the country with the news that the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed. The golden spike was removed after the ceremony and replaced with traditional iron spikes. 3 other ties, one of gold, one of silver and gold, and one of silver, were also presented at the ceremony. The original golden spike is now part of the collection of Stanford University, which was founded by Leland Stanford and his wife, Jane, in 1885 in memory of their only son. To conclude, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was monumental for the United States, opening up the American West to more rapid development. With the completion of the track, the travel time for making the 3,000-mile journey across the United States was cut from a matter of months to under a week. Connecting the two American coasts made the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets easier than ever before. The railroad also facilitated westward expansion, escalating conflicts between Native American tribes and settlers who now had easier access to new territories. Thank you everyone for watching, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments about today's historical topic and video. Would like to share what your group talked about in relation to today's video, or more generally, would be interested in volunteering with Generation Connection. We're hoping these videos can really add some passion and excitement to the lives of the elderly residents in our partner assisted living facilities, especially during the tough times of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, thank you to everyone who watched, and have a fantastic rest of your day.